You may not believe that poverty can push a man toward choices that make his heart pound with fear and tremble with hope. At the same time, you may not believe that sometimes fate knocks on our door in ways no one could ever predict. But it's the truth, and this is the story of Mason Calaway. Mason was a single father working as a janitor at the headquarters of Aldrich Holdings in Austin, Texas, a man whom life had pushed all the way to the edge every morning. Mason woke up before the sun even had the chance to rise, not because of an alarm clock, but because of the dry cough coming from the small room next door. Ellie, his 6-year-old daughter with crystal blue eyes, carried a congenital heart condition that needed urgent surgery. And Mason, he had nothing but a pair of calloused hands and a mountain of medical debt weighing on him like the sky, collapsing on his shoulders. Mason's life hadn't always been this bleak. 3 years ago, he had a family, a small house in suburban Austin, a steady job at an auto repair shop, and a wife he believed would walk with him for the rest of his life, Dana. But everything fell apart the day the doctor told them Ellie needed heart surgery. A surgery that costs more than $200,000 insurance wouldn't cover it. And Dana, she looked at Mason with cold eyes and said a sentence that felt like someone squeezing his heart until it cracked. "I can't live like this anymore." She left, not because she didn't love Ellie, but because she wasn't strong enough to stand in the middle of a storm. That big, she chose another life with another man, in another city, and Mason, he stayed, because that was the only thing he knew how to do. He sold the house, paid off a portion of the debt, moved into a cramped apartment on the east side of the city, and took a janitor position at Aldrich Holdings, one of the largest financial corporations in Texas, simply because the pay was slightly higher, and they allowed him to work night shifts so he could be with Ellie during the day. Every night when the skyscraper sank into silence, Mason wiped every glass panel polished, every marble floor, cleaned offices so luxurious he knew he would never sit in them, and every night when he walked past the 47th floor, the top floor of the building, he always saw a light still on. It was the office of Caroline Aldrich. Caroline wasn't just the CEO of Aldrich Holdings. She was the owner, the heiress, the most powerful female billionaire in Texas. Rumor had it, she could buy an entire town without blinking, that she once fired an executive, simply because he dared to look her in the eye, that she had never smiled in front of any employee. Mason had never spoken to her. He had never even been within 10 meters of her for a man like him. Caroline Aldrich belonged to another world, a world of private jets, lavish galas, and decisions that could change the fate of thousands. But everything changed. One night in October, that night, Mason was wiping the stairs on the 46th floor when his phone buzzed. It was the hospital. The nurse's voice made his heart stop. "Mr. Calaway, Ellie's condition is worsening. The doctor says the surgery can't wait any longer. We need your answer within a week." Mason collapsed onto the steps, the phone still in his hand. 1 week, he needed $200,000 in 1 week, and his bank account didn't even have $300. He had no idea how long he sat there, maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. Then a voice, cold sharp as a blade, echoed above him. "What are you doing here?" Mason looked up. Caroline Aldrich stood at the top of the staircase, staring down at him. A perfect black suit, blonde hair in a tight bun, icy blue eyes. I'm sorry, ma'am." Mason jumped to his feet, hastily wiping his tears. "I'll get back to work right away." But Caroline didn't leave. She stood there looking at him as if she were reading an open book. "You work the night shift, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." Mason Calaway. "I've been here 8 months. Caroline stayed silent for a moment, then spoke, her voice, not loud, but powerful enough to hush the entire stairwell. "Tomorrow morning." 7 oohed my office before he could ask anything. She turned away, the sound of her heels echoing through the vast, empty space that night. Mason couldn't sleep. He lay on the old sofa, staring at the peeling ceiling, wondering what he had done wrong. Was she going to fire him for crying on the job, if he lost this job? What else did he have left? At 7 the next morning, Mason stood in front of the glass doors of the 47th floor. He had never seen this place during the day. Texas sunlight poured through the massive windows, making the office look like a palace. Caroline's secretary. Elle led him in. The office was as big as his entire apartment. Marble floors, a black oak desk, a full wall of glass overlooked Austin, where other buildings looked like miniature toys. Caroline sat behind her desk. She didn't invite him to sit. She simply looked at him, then pushed a brown leather briefcase forward. Open it. Mason took the briefcase with trembling hands. Inside was a thick folder, and the moment he flipped to the first page, his heart nearly stopped. It was Ellie's medical file. The diagnosis, the treatment plan, the surgery cost, every detail. Where did you get this? Mason choked. Caroline didn't answer. She stood, walked toward the window, her back facing him. I can help your daughter, Mason. I can pay for the entire surgery, erase all your debts, give you and your child a new home, a new life. Mason stood frozen, as if his soul had left his body. What he heard was too big to be real. Then Caroline turned her blue eyes sharp and cold, but in return, she said each word, falling like metal hitting the ground. You must give me something. Something? Money can't buy the room. Suddenly felt so heavy that Mason could barely breathe. What is it, ma'am? Caroline walked closer, close enough for him to smell her expensive perfume, close enough for him to see the tired folds around her eyes, and in a voice that didn't tremble at all. She said, I want you to give me a child. If you're still listening at this point, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part where the truth behind Caroline's offer begins to unfold. But what Mason doesn't know is that the real reason Caroline needs a child is far more bitter and dangerous than he could ever imagine. Can you guess what it is? We will continue right after this. Doug stood there like a statue. He was certain he had misheard. Ma'am, I don't understand. Caroline returned to her desk, sitting down with the poise of someone far too familiar with controlling everything around her. You heard me perfectly well. Mason, I don't like repeating myself, but why you could have anyone. You could what Caroline cut him off, her voice. Sharp, hire a surrogate, find a man from the upper class. Do you think I haven't tried? She opened a drawer and pulled out another file thicker than Ellie's. 15 years. Mason, 15 years. I've been searching for a man I could trust. And do you know what I found? She tossed the file onto the desk. Papers spilled out, covert photos, prenuptial contracts, private investigation reports. The first one, a lawyer in Dallas secretly signed a deal with a rival firm right before proposing to me. The second, a doctor supposedly respectable, turned out to be dating 3 other women at the same time. The third. Caroline paused for the first time. Mason saw something different in her eyes. Not anger. Pain. The third was Richard Mercer. Son of a prestigious family. Handsome, charming, said. Exactly what I wanted to hear. I nearly married him. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city of Austin, slowly wakened beneath the morning sun one day before the wedding. I found a prenup agreement he had hidden in his briefcase. He'd hired his own lawyer to draft it with clauses that, if I signed, would give him control of 30% of my assets the moment we married. Mason stayed silent. He didn't know what to say. That was when I understood. Caroline continued, her voice lower. No one wants me. They only want what I have. My name, my wealth, my power. No one sees Caroline. They only see the Aldrich name. She turned and looked directly at Mason. But you're different. Me, Mason couldn't hide his shock. I'm just the janitor, ma'am, exactly. Caroline nodded. You're the only person in this building who wants nothing from me. You don't flatter. You don't try to get close. You even avoid looking at me whenever I pass by. I just thought that was polite. That's honesty. Caroline stepped closer. 8 months. Mason, I've watched you for 8 months. You work hard. You never complain. You don't steal. Not even a pen. And every night at exactly 11, you video call your daughter. No matter how exhausted you are. Mason felt stripped bare. She knew everything about him. I also know about Donna. Caroline said, her tone softening slightly. I know when she left, with whom, and where she is now. I know you have never said one bad word about her in front of Ellie, no matter what she did. Ellie doesn't need to know, Mason murmured. She's lost enough already. Caroline looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded, as if he had just passed an invisible test. That's why I chose you. You're not perfect, but you're decent. And in my world, decency is rarer than diamonds. She pulled the chair across from her and sat down for the first time at eye level with Mason. I'm 41. Mason, my biological clock is counting down. The board of directors. Those old men who worked with my father before I was even born are waiting for me to fail. They want me to be heirless so they can tear apart the company my father spent his life building. So you need a child to prove. The Aldrich legacy will continue. Caroline nodded. And I need a father. I can trust someone who isn't greedy. Someone without political ambitions. Someone who will disappear once it's all over, living his own life with enough money to never look back. Mason felt as if he were standing at a cliff's edge. On one side were all the values he'd been raised with. Honor, integrity, dignity. On the other side was his daughter lying in a hospital bed, counting down the days. What if I refuse? Caroline tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Then you may walk away. No one will ever know about this conversation. You'll continue working as usual. And she paused, I'll find another way. And Ellie, that is not my concern. Caroline's voice turned icy again. I'm offering a business deal. Mason, not charity. Mason lowered his head. He looked down at his worn work boots, then at Caroline's expensive heels, two worlds brutally opposite. I need time to think. Caroline stood and returned behind her desk. You have 24 hours, she said, without looking at him. After that, this door closes forever. Mason walked out of the office like a sleepwalker. The secretary eyed him with curiosity but asked nothing. The elevator carried him down, returning him to the world of ordinary people. But Mason knew from that moment on, he was no longer ordinary. He had been invited into a game whose rules he did not understand, and the price of losing might be his daughter's life on the 47th floor. Caroline stood by the window, watching Mason's small figure step out of the building. She hadn't told him everything. She hadn't mentioned the sleepless nights in her empty penthouse, the echo of her own voice. In rooms far too large, the feeling of being surrounded by hundreds of employees, yet having not a single friend. And she hadn't mentioned what Dr. Harrison Cole told her 2 weeks ago, that if she wanted a child, this might be her last chance, that time was no longer on her side, that sometimes those who have everything are the ones who have lost the most. Caroline placed her hand on the cold glass, looking down at the city she nearly owned. And for the first time in many years, she wondered whether there was something in this world that money truly couldn't buy. The answer she knew now rested in the hands of a janitor. Mason couldn't remember how he drove home when he pushed open the door of the small apartment. The smell of medicine and thin porridge hit him. Immediately, his mother Lorraine was sitting beside Ellie's bed, patiently feeding her granddaughter spoon by spoon. Your dad's home, she said, her voice warm but weighed down by exhaustion. At 72, her hands had already begun to tremble from early-stage Parkinson's, yet she still tried her best to help Mason take care of Ellie whenever he worked nights. "Daddy." Ellie squeaked, her bright blue eyes lighting up like two tiny stars, but her voice was weak, and her pale skin made Mason feel as if someone were crushing his heart. He walked over and kissed her forehead gently. "Did you sleep well? I dreamed you bought me a big house," Ellie whispered, "with a garden and a swing and a dog too." Mason swallowed hard. "I'll buy it for you someday, I promise." Lorraine looked at her son with worried eyes. She knew something was wrong. 32 years of motherhood had taught her how to read every flicker in Mason's face. "Ellie, sweetheart." "Get a little more sleep," she said, brushing the child's hair. "Grandma needs to talk to your dad." Ellie nodded obediently, her eyes already drooping. Mason pulled the blanket up for her, then followed his mother to the small balcony. The apartment was on the 4th floor, overlooking an alley full of trash and noise from the bar down the street. But it was still the best place Mason could afford with his current salary. "What's going on, son?" Lorraine asked her, trembling hands gripping the iron railing. Mason stayed silent for a long time. He didn't know where to begin. "Mom, if I had a chance to save Ellie, but that chance required me to do something. Something I'm not sure is right or wrong. What do you think I should do?" She looked at him, her aging eyes still sharp. "What are you talking about? Be clearer. I can't say the details." Mason shook his head. It has to do with someone very wealthy. Someone who could pay for Ellie's entire surgery. Everything. But in return, he couldn't finish. Lorraine went quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is it illegal?" "No. Does it hurt anyone?" Mason thought of Caroline. The icy eyes hide loneliness, the stories she told, the wounds she couldn't fully conceal. "I don't know. Mom, I really don't." Lorraine exhaled slowly, turning her eyes back toward the apartment where Ellie was sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with effort. "You know what your father died of, right?" Mason nodded. His father. Harold Calaway had died 5 years ago of lung cancer, a mechanic who worked for 40 years, never took a vacation, never complained. "Once your father was the kindest man I've ever known." Lorraine said, her voice trembling slightly. "He worked his whole life, never owed anyone a cent, never did anything wrong, and he died in the cheapest hospital room simply because we couldn't afford better care." She turned to Mason, her eyes reddening. "I loved your father. I'm proud of him. But sometimes I wonder if he had been a little more flexible, a little more willing to compromise. Would he still be alive today?" A sharp pain shot through Mason's chest. "What are you trying to say?" She took his hand and squeezed it gently. "I don't know what that person wants from you. But I know one thing." She directed her eyes toward Ellie. "That child is all we have left, if there's a way to save her without selling your soul to the devil. Then, son, think very carefully before turning it down." She stood, placing a gentle hand on Mason's shoulder. "I can't decide for you. This is your life, but whatever you choose, I'll stand with you." Then she went back inside, leaving Mason alone under Austin's ashen sky that night. Mason didn't sleep. He sat beside Ellie's bed, listening to every labored breath. She took the heart monitor aloner from the hospital, beeped steadily like a death clock counting down. The doctor said Ellie might not make it another 6 months, without surgery. 6 months. 180 days. Mason had tried everything. He applied for a bank loan, denied because he had no collateral. He called Dana. She wouldn't answer. He created a fundraising page, raised a few $1,000s before disappearing among countless other desperate stories. He even considered selling a kidney, But it was illegal, and the black market was far too dangerous. Mason looked down at his calloused hands that had cleaned thousands of square feet of flooring, repaired hundreds of old cars, held Ellie since she was just a small, red, fragile newborn. Could these hands actually save his daughter? Then he thought of Caroline, a woman who had everything, yet had nothing. A woman betrayed so deeply, she no longer believed in love. A woman who was the most powerful figure in Austin, yet also the loneliest. Caroline wanted a child. Not love, not marriage, just a child. And he could give her that. Mason got up and walked to the window. The city lights spilled across the night sky, like a million fallen stars. His father had lived a life of unbending principles, integrity, honesty, no compromise, and he died in poverty. Mason didn't want Ellie crying at her father's grave, the way he cried at his own father's. He pulled out his phone and looked at the business card Caroline's secretary had given him, the personal number of the most powerful woman in Texas. His hands trembled violently. His heart pounded like a war drum. He pressed, called. The phone rang 3 times. "Have you made your decision?" Caroline's voice came through cold, distant Mason. Took a deep breath, looking at Ellie, sleeping her angelic face dim under the weak yellow light, yet he said. His voice hoarse, "I agree." Silence lasted for a few seconds. Then Caroline replied, without the slightest change in her tone. "Tomorrow morning, Thwertor. I will send someone to pick you up." The call ended. Mason stood there, phone still in his hand, staring into the Austin night. He had crossed a boundary one he could never return from, and he had no idea that from this moment on, his life would be forever changed, not just because of the deal with Caroline, but because sometimes, when 2 lonely people brush against each other by accident, what happens next is something no one on earth can ever predict. At exactly 8 in the morning, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of Mason's apartment. He had been up since 6, showered, and put on the neatest clothes he owned, a white shirt that had started to fade, and an old pair of dress pants. Before leaving, he leaned down to kiss Ellie's forehead, as she slept, told his mother he had to go out for something. Then closed the door behind him. The driver stepped out and opened the car door, without saying a word. Inside, there was the faint smell of expensive leather and the cool air from the AC. When Mason sat down, he felt as if he had just stepped onto another planet. The car glided through the familiar streets of Austin, then turned into Westlake Hills, where mansions hid behind tall fences and heavy iron gates. Mason had never set foot there. He only knew it was where the wealthiest people in Texas lived. The Mercedes stopped in front of an enormous gate. A security camera shifted, scanned the license plate, and then the gate slowly opened. A stone-paved driveway stretched for a good 100 meters, lined on both sides with towering oak trees. At the end of the driveway, Caroline Aldrich's mansion appeared like a castle. Mason could hardly believe his eyes. The house, no palace was the only right word, was built in a Mediterranean style, with white domes, soaring columns, and huge windows, facing a bright blue pool in the back. The lawn was trimmed to perfection, like a velvet carpet stone. Statues stood scattered across the garden, motionless like silent sentries. The driver opened the door. "Mr. Calaway, this way, please." Mason stepped out, his legs slightly shaky. The front door opened, and a middle-aged woman in a housekeeper's uniform appeared. "Mr. Calaway." "I'm Margaret. Mrs. Aldrich is waiting for you in the sitting room." Mason followed Margaret across a vast foyer. The polished white marble floor reflected the light from a massive crystal chandelier above oil paintings lined the walls. Each one probably worth as much as his entire apartment. The air was cold and so still, it felt strange. No laughter, no chatter, none of the sounds of a normal home, only the echo of Margaret's heels in the empty space. Caroline was sitting in the living room by a stone fireplace. She wore a light gray dress, her blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her blue eyes following his every step. "Sit," she said, pointing to the chair across from her. Mason sat down. The chair was so soft, he felt as if his body were sinking into clouds. "Have you had breakfast?" "No, ma'am." Caroline gave Margaret a brief nod. A few minutes later, a small table was wheeled in, loaded with toast, fresh fruit, and dishes. Mason didn't even know the names of. "Eat," Caroline said. "You'll need your strength." Mason didn't understand what she meant, but he was so hungry he couldn't refuse. He picked up a slice of toast and tried to eat slowly, as politely as he could. Caroline watched him, her gaze as if she were evaluating something very valuable. "Today, Dr. Harrison Cole will come to perform a health check on you," she said. "Blood tests, full examination. I need to be sure you are completely healthy before we proceed." Mason nodded. "I understand. After that, my lawyer will have you sign a non-disclosure agreement. If you break any of its terms, you will lose everything and face very serious legal consequences. Do you understand?" "Yes," Caroline tilted her head slightly, her eyes as sharp as knives. "You have no questions, no worries, no doubts at all." Mason put the toast down. "Ma'am, I spent the whole night thinking I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm doing it." He looked straight at Caroline. "My daughter is waiting. I no longer have the luxury of doubt or hesitation." Caroline was silent for a moment, then nodded for a brief second. A flicker of satisfaction passed through her cold blue eyes. "Good. I like people who know what they want, Dr. Harrison." Cole arrived in the afternoon. He was a man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a calm face. He brought a whole team of nurses and a series of medical devices, as if preparing for surgery, rather than a simple health check. They drew blood, took his blood pressure, and listened to his heart and lungs. They asked about his family medical history, his diet, his daily habits, even his sex life. Mason answered everything, feeling as though each invisible layer of armor he had was being peeled away after the medical team left. Dr. Cole stayed behind to speak with Caroline in her study. Mason sat alone in the living room, his eyes wandering over every detail of the luxurious mansion that was when he noticed not a single family photograph, no wedding pictures, no childhood photos, no snapshots. With friends, only art and expensive decorative pieces, beautiful, perfect, but soulless. This mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Mason stood and walked over to the large window overlooking the garden. The pool shimmered blue in the afternoon sun. A bird landed on the pool's edge, tilted its head to look around, then flapped its wings and flew away. "What are you thinking about?" Mason turned. Caroline was standing behind him, arms crossed. "I was thinking," he hesitated, then answered honestly. "This house is very beautiful, but it's also very quiet." Caroline stepped forward, standing beside him. "Silence is something I can buy," she said, her voice tinged with faint bitterness. "Noise, chaos, uncontrolled emotions. Those are things I don't need, but you need a child." Caroline turned to him for a moment. Something softened in her eyes, a hint of fragility she quickly concealed. A child is for the future, for the legacy, for things bigger than personal feelings. Mason said nothing. He wondered whether she truly believed what she had just said, or if she was trying to convince herself, "Your test results are excellent." Caroline continued, changing the subject. "Dr. Cole confirmed you are completely healthy, no genetic diseases, no concerning issues. So when will we start?" Caroline looked out the window. "Next week. I need time to prepare some things. In the meantime, you'll stay here." Mason was startled. "But my daughter." "Tomorrow, Ellie will be transferred to the best hospital in Austin." Caroline set her tone, leaving no room for argument. "All expenses will be covered by me. Your mother will also be given comfortable accommodation near the hospital so she can care for her. Mason parted his lips, about to say something, but Caroline had already turned away. Margaret will show you to your room. Rest. You'll need your strength for what's coming. She left the room, leaving Mason alone in the vast space. He looked around the mansion, feeling like a small fish dropped into the open ocean. Everything was happening too fast, too overwhelming, far beyond his understanding. But when he thought of Ellie, of her getting treatment at the best hospital, Mason knew he had no right to complain. He had chosen to step into this world, and now he had to accept its rules. That night, Mason lay on the largest bed he had ever seen in a guest room. As big as his old apartment, the AC hummed softly. The sheets were spotless, and white as soft as clouds. Everything was so perfect it felt unreal, but he couldn't sleep. He lay there staring up at the high ceiling, his mind spinning with images of Ellie, his mother, and whatever awaited him ahead. Mason wasn't entirely sure what he was feeling. Fear, guilt, pity, or some strange emotion he didn't yet dare to name. He only knew one thing from this moment on, his life, and Caroline's were bound together, and that bond might change them both in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. A week passed, like a strange dream. Mason lived in Caroline's mansion, treated like an honored guest. Every meal was prepared by her private chef. New clothes were brought to his room. He didn't have to do anything except wait, but the waiting was heavier than any physical labor he had ever done during the day. Caroline vanished into meetings, business trips, and phone calls that lasted for hours. She ran the Aldrich Holdings empire like a machine that never stopped. Meanwhile, Mason wandered around the mansion like a shadow. Every day he video called Ellie. She had been transferred to St. David's Hospital, one of the best in Austin. Her room had a window overlooking the garden, a large TV, and nurses who checked in every hour. "Daddy, it's fun here," Ellie said through the screen. Her blue eyes shining. "The nurse gives me ice cream every day, and Grandma tells me stories every night." Mason smiled, trying to hide the tightness in his throat. "Be good, sweetheart. Daddy will visit you soon." "Where are you, Daddy? Why don't you come home?" Mason froze. He didn't know how to answer. "Daddy's working far away, baby. A very important job to get money to help you get better." "What job, Daddy?" "You don't need to worry, I promise. Everything will be okay." Ellie nodded, trusting him completely, and that trust tore Mason apart. He was lying to his daughter, and he hated himself for it. On the 7th night, Caroline called him into her study. The room was on the 2nd floor, with bookshelves stretching up to the ceiling and a massive oak desk in the center. Caroline sat behind it, a glass of red wine swirling in front of her. "Sit," she said, pointing to the chair across from her. Mason pulled the chair out and sat down. He realized this was the first time the two of them had spoken privately since he moved in. "The final test. Results are in." Caroline began, her voice as calm and cold as ever. "Everything is in order. We can begin." Mason nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Begin when tonight." Silence dropped into the room. Mason felt his heartbeat speeding with each second. Caroline stood, walked to the window. The moonlight poured in, coating her figure in a faint silver sheen. "Are you afraid?" she asked, still facing away from him. Mason didn't answer immediately. He sat there thinking, then decided to be honest. "Yes." Caroline turned back. "Afraid of what of many things," Mason said, slowly. "Afraid. I don't know if this is right or wrong. Afraid I'll regret it later. Afraid," he hesitated. "Afraid of you. Afraid of me." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Not afraid you'll hurt me." Mason quickly clarified, "But afraid that I don't understand you. I don't know what you really want." Caroline was silent for a long time. Then she did something. Mason never expected. She laughed, not the cold, calculated laugh he had seen before, but a short, bitter laugh, like someone laughing at themselves. "You're the first person to say that to me," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Everyone fears me, but no one dares say it out loud." She walked closer and sat in the chair beside him. It was the first time they had ever sat this close. "You want to know what I truly want?" Caroline turned the glass slowly in her hand. "I'm not even sure anymore." Mason stared at her, surprised. "I thought you always knew what you wanted. You run an entire corporation." "Running a corporation is easy," Caroline cut him off. "There are rules, numbers, strategies. But life?" She shook her head. "Life doesn't have a manual." She took a sip of wine, her gaze drifting far away. "Do you know when I started running the company, when I was 26, my father had a stroke and became bedridden. The board wanted to sell everything. And I, a girl fresh out of college, had to stand up against those wolves in the financial world." "And you won," Mason said quietly. "I won," Caroline nodded. "But it took me 15 years to win 15 years. Without rest, without friends, without love. Only work. Work, and more work." She set the wine glass down and looked directly at Mason. "Do you know the worst part, that by the time I finally had room to live my life, I realized I had forgotten how Mason stayed silent. He simply listened. This house has 12 bedrooms," Caroline continued. "I use one. I have 5 cars. I drive one. I can buy anything in this world. But I cannot buy a single evening of dinner with a family." Her voice tightened. "My mother died when I was 12. Breast cancer," Caroline spoke slowly. She lay in her hospital bed holding my hand and said, "Caroline, don't be like me. Don't let life pass before you've lived it." I promised her, and in the end, I still broke that promise. Her blue eyes glimmered under the light. She was crying, but refusing to let the tears fall. "That's why I want a child," she whispered. "Not just for legacy, not for the board, but because I want someone to love someone who can't leave me because of money. Someone who belongs with me." She looked at Mason, and for the first time, he saw real vulnerability in her eyes. "Do you think I'm insane?" Mason slowly shook his head. "No, I think you're lonely. Lonely enough to do anything just to not be lonely anymore." Caroline held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps you're the first person who has ever truly understood me that night." They walked into Caroline's bedroom, a vast room with a king-size bed draped in white silk sheets, heavy velvet curtains covering the windows, and flickering candles filling the air with a soft lavender scent. But there was nothing romantic about it. Only 2 lonely people standing across from each other in a heavy silence. Caroline slipped off her coat, revealing a black silk nightgown. She was beautiful, beautiful in the flawless, cold way of a Greek sculpture. Mason stood still, his limbs stiff, unsure what to do. "You don't have to love me," Caroline said, her voice turning cold again, as if rebuilding a wall. "You only have to do what needs to be done." Mason stepped closer, looking into her blue eyes, searching for something beneath the ice. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Caroline didn't answer. She simply nodded, and that night in the bedroom of the most powerful woman in Texas, 2 lonely people came together, not out of love, not out of desire, but out of an agreement, a transaction, an exchange. At least that's what they both tried to tell themselves. But sometimes, things that begin as a deal end in ways no one ever expects that night. As Caroline lay in the dark, with her back to Mason, she whispered something so softly, he thought he imagined it. "Thank you for not looking at me like an object." Mason didn't reply, but he heard every word, and for the first time he felt something shift inside him. Not guilt, not fear, but compassion. compassion for a woman who had everything yet had never once been truly loved. The following weeks passed with a strange rhythm. During the day, Mason went to the hospital to visit Ellie. He sat by her bed, read her stories, watched cartoons with her, and tried to act as if everything was still normal at night. He returned to Caroline's mansion. They met in the bedroom, did what needed to be done. Then each went back to their own world. At least, that was how things were in the beginning. But slowly, something began to change. One evening after leaving the bedroom, Mason went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water. He didn't expect to find Caroline there too, sitting alone at the dining table with a bowl of instant noodles in front of her. Instant noodles. The billionaire who owned an empire was eating instant noodles at midnight. Mason couldn't hide his surprise. Caroline looked up, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of embarrassment on her face, an expression Mason had never seen on her. "Before the chef's gone home, and I don't know how to cook anything else," she said, her voice sounding almost like she was defending herself. Mason opened the fridge inside. It was full of fine ingredients: Wagyu beef, fresh seafood, and organic vegetables. "Would you like me to cook something for you?" Caroline looked at him as if he had just said something utterly strange. "You can cook." Mason smiled, truly. Smiled for the first time since he'd stepped into the mansion. "I'm a single dad." "Ma'am, if I couldn't cook, my daughter would starve." He took a few eggs, some cheese, turned on the stove, and started making fried eggs. The smell of butter melting in the hot pan spread through the huge kitchen. Caroline sat there, silently watching him work, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Where did you learn to cook from my mother?" Mason replied, his hands moving quickly over the pan. "When I was a kid, I used to stand and watch her cook." She said, "A real man is someone who knows how to take care of himself and the people he loves." He placed the plate of eggs in front of Caroline. "It's not anything fancy, but I'm sure it's better than instant noodles." Caroline looked at the eggs, then at him for a moment. Her eyes softened. "Thank you." It was the first time she had thanked him without the cover of darkness. From that night on, things began to change. Caroline no longer left immediately after they had been together. Sometimes she stayed sitting on the bed or on the sofa and started talking. She talked about work, about meetings stretched tight, like a wire, about rivals waiting for a chance to bring her down, about the decisions she had to make. Every day, decisions that could affect thousands of people. And Mason listened. He didn't understand much about finance stocks or multi-million-dollar deals, but he understood what it felt like to be crushed by pressure. He understood loneliness. He understood what it meant to carry a world on your shoulders with no one to lean on. "Don't you get bored listening to me?" Caroline asked one night. Mason shook his head. "No one gets bored when someone trusts them enough to share." Ma'am Caroline looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You're a very strange man, Mason Calaway. I'm just a janitor, ma'am." "No," Caroline shook her head slightly. "You're more than that. You just haven't realized it yet." One afternoon while Mason was at the hospital visiting Ellie, she suddenly asked Dad, "Who's the person paying for my treatment?" Mason froze. "Why do you ask that?" Grandma said, "Someone kind helped our family." Ellie said, her clear blue eyes fixed on him, "I want to say thank you to them." Mason swallowed hard. He didn't know how to answer. "It's a very special person, sweetheart," he did, slowly. "Someday I'll tell you everything as that person." Kind Dad, Mason thought of Caroline, the cold eyes, the rare smile, the shaky "thank you" in the dark. That person is complicated. "Honey," he said, "but deep down, I think they're a good person. It's just that life has made them forget how to show it." Ellie nodded, her face thoughtful, like a little girl far older than her years, like Mommy Dana. "Dad," Mason's heart clenched, his daughter. still said Mommy Dana. Not Mom, since the day Dana left. Ellie had never called anyone else Mom again. No, sweetheart, Mason said gently. This person is different. Different. How Mason stayed quiet for a moment, Mommy. Dana left because she was afraid. But this person stayed, even though they've lived their whole life in fear. A week later, Dr. Harrison Cole returned to the mansion. Mason was sitting in the living room when he arrived, holding a black leather briefcase. His face serious, Caroline invited the doctor into her study. The door closed. Mason couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Margaret, the housekeeper, walk past with a briefly tense look on her face. Half an hour later, Dr. Cole left. Caroline still didn't appear. Mason waited an hour. 2, still no sign of her. Finally, he decided to go look for her. He knocked on the study door. No answer. Mason pushed the door open and stepped inside. Caroline was sitting by the window, her back to him. Her shoulders were trembling. She was crying. Mason had never seen Caroline cry. Not even the night she talked about her mother had she allowed her tears to fall. He walked closer, awkwardness twisting inside him. Mrs. Aldrich. Caroline didn't turn around. Her voice was hoarse, choked. Dr. Cole said, "I'm pregnant." Mason felt as if someone had slammed a hammer into his chest. That's good news, isn't it? Ma'am, Caroline turned around. Her face was streaked with tears. But what he saw in her eyes wasn't joy. It was fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been pregnant twice before. Both times." She trailed off. Mason stood frozen. Twice before, Caroline nodded, the tears starting up again. "The first time I was 28 with Richard, the man I almost married. I miscarried at 10 weeks. After that, I found out the truth about him and called off the wedding." She took a breath, trying to steady herself. "The second time I was 35. I decided to do it on my own. Artificial insemination. But it was an ectopic pregnancy. I almost died. The doctor said that after that, my chances of getting pregnant were nearly 0. Caroline looked at Mason, her eyes red. "You are my last chance." Mason, and now Dr. Cole says the embryo has implanted in the right place. It's developing normally. Her voice broke. "But with my history, the risk of complications is very high. He says I have to rest completely. No stress, no overworking." She let out a laugh, a bitter, broken sound. "No overworking. Does he know who I am? I can't stop. If I stop, they'll tear the company apart." Mason didn't stop to think. He stepped closer and knelt down in front of her. "You won't be alone," he said. His voice steadier than it had ever been. "I know I'm just a janitor. I don't understand business, finance, or your world. But I know how to take care of people. I know how to stay by someone's side when they need it." Caroline stared at him, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You don't have to do that. This isn't part of the deal, I know." Mason nodded, but some things matter more than a deal. He stood and looked out the window. "The baby you're carrying, that's my child too. I can't pretend it doesn't exist. I can't walk away the way Dana did." Caroline was silent for a long time. Then she did something Mason didn't expect. She reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not looking at me like a contract." Mason didn't say anything. He just held her hand tighter. And in that moment, the line between a cold agreement and something deeper, warmer, began to blur. From that day on, everything began to change in ways neither Mason nor Caroline could have predicted. Mason was no longer just the one fulfilling the agreement. He became the person who stayed by Caroline's side every day, the one who reminded her to take her vitamins on time, the one who made sure she ate proper meals, the one who stood right in front of her desk whenever she tried to work until midnight. At first, Caroline resisted fiercely. I don't need anyone to take care of me, she said, her voice cold as steel. I've taken care of myself for 20 years, and you've had 2 miscarriages, Mason replied, his tone unyielding. Do you want a third to happen? Caroline glared at him, but then she fell silent, unable to argue back. Gradually, she began getting used to his presence, used to someone asking, "Have you eaten?" Used to someone waiting outside her office door to say it's time to sleep. Used to someone who genuinely cared about her as a living human being, not as a billionaire CEO holding an entire empire in her hands, and the walls she had spent years building around herself began to crack. One afternoon, Mason was making tea in the kitchen when he heard Caroline speaking on the phone. In her office, her voice was tense, sharp. "I already said. No, Mr. Henderson, that decision is final." A few seconds of silence. Then Caroline continued her tone. "Icy, are you threatening me? Do you think I'm afraid of you? Do you think the board can do anything to me? I hold 52% of this company. You and your old cronies can hold meetings until your bones turn to dust, and it still won't change a thing." Then came the sound of a phone being slammed onto the desk, followed by heavy breathing. Mason knocked gently and stepped inside a cup of hot tea. In hand, Caroline was sitting behind her desk, her hands covering her head. When she looked up, her face was pale. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled. "It's just the vultures are starting to smell blood." Mason placed the cup in front of her. "What happened?" Caroline hesitated for a moment. If this had been before, she would never have shared company matters with an outsider. But now, Henderson, the vice chairman of the board. She said tiredly, "He was my father's close friend. Ever since my father died, he's believed he should be the one running the company. Not me. What does he want? He noticed I've been reducing my workload, missing a few important meetings. That I'm changing." Caroline looked up at Mason. He suspects something's wrong, and he's trying to dig until he finds it. A cold chill ran through Mason's spine. "Does he know about us yet?" No, Caroline shook her head. "But he has people watching me." I'm certain she stood up and walked to the window. "If he finds out about our agreement, he'll turn it into a weapon. He'll leak it to the press, to the shareholders, to the entire world." Her voice was bitter. "Billionaire CEO pays janitor to give her a child. Can you imagine the headlines?" Mason stayed silent. He had never thought that far ahead. He'd focused only on Ellie, on the surgery, on saving his daughter, and had forgotten that Caroline had everything to lose. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I never wanted to bring trouble to you." Caroline turned around, looking straight at him. "You didn't bring trouble. The trouble was already there, long before you came." She sighed. "I'm just tired of fighting alone." Mason stepped closer. "You're not alone anymore." Caroline looked at him, something flickering in her eyes, something she didn't dare name. "Why are you being so kind to me? You already have what you needed. Your daughter is receiving treatment. All you have to do is follow the contract exactly, nothing more." Mason was silent for a moment before answering. "Because you remind me of someone who... my father." Mason said he was the kind of man who carried everything alone, never complained, never asked for help, and in the end, he died. With no one holding his hand, he looked straight at Caroline. "I don't want anyone else to end up like that. Not even you." Caroline stood there silent. Then she did something she hadn't done with anyone in many years. She stepped forward and rested her head on Mason's shoulder. She said nothing. She simply leaned on him, seeking a little warmth in the arms of the man she had hired to give her a child. Mason didn't speak either. He simply stood there, letting her lean, and in that moment, they both understood that whatever was happening between them had gone far beyond the boundaries of an agreement. In the days that followed, Mason began to see more clearly who Caroline truly was. She wasn't just the cold billionaire on stage making decisions with a signature. She was also the woman who jolted awake at 3 in the morning from nightmares about her mother. She was the woman who sat alone at night reading children's books, the same ones her mother used to read to her. She was the woman who kept an old, worn teddy bear in her bedside drawer, the last gift her mother gave her before she died one night. Mason woke abruptly to the sound of muffled crying. He followed the sound down the hallway to a room at the very end, a room he had never seen open since the day he moved in. The door was slightly ajar. Mason pushed it gently. Caroline was sitting on the floor, clutching an old wooden box, tears streaming down her face. Mason tapped lightly on the door frame. Caroline looked up quickly and wiped her tears. "What? What are you doing here?" I heard Mason hesitated. "Are you all right?" Caroline looked down at the box in her lap. Inside were old photographs, a few handwritten letters, and a tarnished silver bracelet. "Today is my mother's death anniversary," she said, her voice raw. "It's been 29 years. Mason stepped into the room and sat beside her. This room was unlike any other in the mansion. No luxurious furniture, no expensive art. Just a small single bed, a little table, and the walls covered with photographs, photos of a gentle, smiling blonde woman holding a little girl in her arms. "This was my mother's room," Caroline whispered. "I kept everything the same since the day she died. No one comes in here. Not even the cleaners." She handed Mason a picture. "This was the last photo we took together a week before she passed." Mason looked at it. Caroline was around 11 or 12, smiling brightly beside her mother. The eyes of the little girl in the picture were bright and innocent. Nothing like the coldness of the woman beside him. Now she was beautiful. Mason said she was the most wonderful person I ever knew. Caroline whispered. She didn't care about money or power. She just wanted a happy family. She wanted to see me grow up. She wanted grandchildren to hold her voice broke. But none of that ever came true. Mason didn't know what to say. He simply sat there, quietly, letting the silence between them become something other than loneliness. "You know," Caroline said after a long while, "the baby I'm carrying, if it's a girl, I want to name her. After my mother. What was her name?" "Eleanor." Caroline smiled faintly through her tears. "Eleanor Rose Aldrich." Mason's heart thudded hard. Eleanor Ellie, exactly the same name as his daughter. He didn't say it aloud, but the coincidence felt like an invisible thread suddenly tying them together. "That's a beautiful name," he said softly. Caroline nodded, and then she did something she hadn't dared do with anyone else. For many years, she began telling Mason about her childhood, about afternoons reading in the garden with her mom, about simple family dinners, before her father became consumed by work, about her childhood dreams, not of becoming a CEO or a billionaire, but of having a normal life, with a normal family. And Mason listened until the first rays of morning slipped through the window that night. For the first time in many years, Caroline fell asleep with her head resting on Mason's shoulder, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't have nightmares. 2 months passed. Caroline's pregnancy progressed so steadily that even she didn't dare believe it every week. Dr. Cole came to the mansion for a checkup. He always nodded in satisfaction, and sometimes even allowed himself a faint smile. Rare for someone who had worked in medicine for so many years. "Everything's good. Very good." He would often say Caroline's belly had begun to curve slightly, just enough to be noticeable beneath the soft fabric of the loose dresses she'd been wearing lately. A small, fragile curve, but it was the miracle she had waited for her entire life. And Ellie Mason's little fighter had finally made it through the biggest surgery of her life. The news from the hospital came on a Tuesday morning. Mason's legs gave out. When he heard the words, the surgery was successful. His knees hit the floor right there in the crowded hallway, both hands covering his face. He didn't remember how long he cried. He only remembered the head surgeon placing a hand on his shoulder, his voice deep and gentle. "She's very strong. We did everything we could." And she responded. The operation had lasted 8 hours. 8 hours. That felt like an entire lifetime to Mason. But now, at last, there was an answer. Ellie needed a few more weeks to recover before being discharged, but with each passing day, Mason watched the color return to her cheeks. Her voice grew more cheerful, her laughter filling the hospital room every time Mason visited. "Daddy," Ellie asked one day, her blue eyes sparkling with hope. "When can I go home soon?" Daddy's Princess Mason hugged her tightly. Very soon, he kissed her forehead, feeling a wave of relief spread through his chest. For the first time in many years, Mason felt as if life was opening a new door for him, one that was warm and full of hope. He had no idea that while he was savoring that small joy, another storm was quietly forming, a storm that would not come from the hospital, but from the place he least expected, the world of Caroline Aldrich. My dear friend, if you've stayed with me until this very minute, perhaps you feel it too. The story between Mason, Ellie, and Caroline, which began as a cold, precise agreement, is no longer just a transaction. It has become something harder to name, harder to measure, and perhaps harder to escape. Will Caroline be strong enough to protect the child growing inside her while still safeguarding the empire she sacrificed her entire youth to build? Will Mason, the man who seemed to enter that world solely for his daughter's sake, truly have the courage to stand between two halves of his life? On one side, Ellie, the only thing he has, and on the other, Caroline, a woman who seems untouchable, yet is more fragile than anyone. And these peaceful days, how long can they really last before the next storm hits? If you want to hear the next part of this story to see which choices will open a new path for all three of them, don't forget, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave me a comment. I want part 2. Who knows? Maybe your comment will be the very reason part 2 comes out sooner than you think.